Good evening, everyone. And well, we're in week 11. Time is moving on quickly. And I hope that you have been paying attention to the fact that you have your commentary coming up. It's minimum 800 words, counts 20%. Now you've all completed the 4 steps, and I hope that in doing so you've gained some familiarity with what's involved with this kind of analysis. And I hope that from what you've been looking at, giving yourselves a sense of what's there in the text. And even though you will rely on the model that I've given you for the clause-based theme, transitivity, and logical, still it's been very important for you to sort of be able to do it yourself, even though there will be areas in which hopefully you've been able to see how you could improve. At the same time, you by now you should have a feel for what is the personality of the text that you're analyzing. So the commentary, and this will be due on the 14th of April. This will be week 12. We have a break next week because of the holiday. And then when we come back, then you will be submitting your commentary. No, I'm not providing a model commentary other than what I've been covering with you in the lectures, going through the other text, the other spoken word performance that Brandon gave. And on the basis of what we've been talking about in the lecture, I hope that you will draw out some observations that you are making about the other text that you've been analyzing for the last few weeks. Today, I do want to cover with you several things. One of those is that we will be looking at the logical analysis, the model that I've done. And if you have questions, please feel free to raise them. Some of you have already asked questions based on your own as you were going through it. And there may be points that you may be questioning what you see there in the model. I will try my best to explain the rationale behind the choices that I've made. Before I get to that, let me just tell you today what we're going to be covering. We will be looking at logical meaning. There was one speech from Nixon that I wanted to cover before we didn't finish it. I want to do that, the second inaugural text. It says some important things about texture and architecture. And we will look at Steve Jobs' commencement speech and discuss that. Then we will move on to looking at examples of what you can expect in the final exam. And I'm going to be giving you 2 examples today. The first one, and both of these I have used before in exams, so they are quite realistic. You'll get a good sense of what's the format of the exam paper, how it will be conducted, and so in that sense, it should be hopefully helpful to you. But I don't want you to also just think of it as like practice tests. These are learning exercises as well, and they I hope will be able to help develop in your ability to be making observations based on the kind of analysis that we've been doing. All right, so I do think that they're more, to me, I consider them more than just practice for your exam. I consider them learning exercises as well. And I hope that's how you'll see it too. So we'll come to that. Now, I do want to mention there are on Canvas, I made an announcement to this. I know not all of you read the announcements, it seems, but in any case, I do want you to be aware of what's on Canvas, because in a way, I'd like you to have sort of printed it out for today's class, so that you could be referring to it as sort of a hard copy in front of you. That would be the ideal. Of course, you can go online and you can download it and you can look at it on your screen. But also, maybe it's I'm old-fashioned. I like more or less the hard copy text in front of me to be able to go through, to read it, to be able to look at it. And this also, you'll get an idea of what, because I don't expect you to analyze on the exam. I give you the analysis. So if you did go on Canvas and you did look up those folders for the 2 practice tests, you'll find that the analyses are there, just like what you've done with the text, the Brandon League's spoken word performance. The analyses are there. What I expect then is that you will be commenting on, similar to your commentary. And that's, the commentary is going to be helpful to you to get sort of a feel for doing this, because that's what you need to do on the exam. You see, it's the approach that we're taking. It's not just that you know how to do, not just that you know what the kind of analysis is, like what is transitivity, what is logical, what is theme. You not only know what they are, you know how to do it, and from the data that you get, you know sort of how, you have an idea as to how to look for the patterns that will tell you something about how that text comes to mean, the textures that are there within the text, the architecture of the text. These will all be important for you to, that's the goal of this course. Before we get to that, and that will be more toward the end of the lesson, or further on in the lesson. I won't say it's the end of the lesson, because we'll spend some time on that. But let's first of all, logical meaning. You should have a very good idea already. It's looking at paratactic and hypotactic. And those terms, I'm just looking at your analyses. I know you know what those mean now, and have a good idea what they are. Yes, I know, looking at it from the standpoint of elaborating, extending, enhancing, projecting, those are more difficult. But again, I was quite pleased with what you were able to do. And let's get to the text itself. This is my model for it. And of course, we need to sort of go through this part by part. So let's begin with the first 5 sentences, which I did already with you. So let's just quickly go through these 5 sentences. And I did sort of color it to try to get a sense of what were the, again, to get an idea of just the patterning. And I notice right away, and as you have too, the fact that the first 4 sentences all have the same sort of pattern. When, a dependent clause, enhancing, followed by the main clause. And I was glad to see, when it came time to put this into the table, that most of you got the idea of what's the difference between the alpha and the beta. And the alpha clause is the main clause. It's not, it doesn't begin. 1A is not the main clause, right? It's the dependent clause. And many of you realize that and put B in the alpha column and A in the beta column. So you got that right. That's good. So 1 and 2 are straightforward, and we've looked at these already. So let me quickly go through these. 3, The 3 was a bit more complicated in the sense that in the beta column of enhancement, I have A, when I'm with the ladies. And then it sort of expands from there. And I have B through D. Let's just say they call me taken because I'm already happily spoken for. So let's just say, well, there is a projection there, right? Let's just say what? 3C. Let's just say, now some of you might say, well, why did I say that's a hypotactic projection? There's no that there, but you can, that has been left out. But you can say when I'm with when I'm with the ladies, let's just say that they call me. See, it is really a dependent clause. It's really a that clause with a that missing. And it's a projected clause. So we put the C in the beta column, and the B is the projecting clause. So let's just say they call me taken. And then D, I put that in if we C and D, well, I put them together in the projecting column, all right? Because let's just say they call me taken because I'm already happily spoken for. Arguable there whether I should have put that as part of the projection. I could, in fact, see that as being sort of an expansion that probably I could have put into the enhancement column of C and D. In a way, I now, as I look at it, I'm inclined to, let's just say, they call me taken. No. As I look at it, let's just say it's what you would, let's just say, he's just saying, like, let's give an example. They call me taken. And so the whole thing, yes, C and D rightly belong in the projected column. 4, again, straightforward there. 5. Now, I had some were asking questions about why I did it the way I did it. For example, to admit it, I was taking admit to be sort of a verbal process. And what is the it? Well, that's the 5C. That my mother calls me Pookie like the most inopportune moments. Again, you'll notice I put in a that there. Can I put a that in? Yeah. Then I take that to be a kind of, again, projected clause, a hypotactic. And it's basically admit. The it there just sort of duplicates what 5C is, right? And so there again, what is the enhancement? No, I'm not afraid. Now that's the main clause, so enhancement. Now some of you asked, one of your classmates asked, why did I put 5B in the enhancement column? I did because, and I replied to say that the way I looked at it was that 5B, it's a non-finite clause. It's the to infinitive. It is, in a way, sort of not afraid for what? What would cause me to be afraid? To admit something. All right. So it is, in a way, a cause. And in that sense, what we put under the enhancement column includes not only the where, when, why, how kind of things, but also what I would take to be the concession, condition, cause, those kinds of things, all right, would be included under enhancement. Let's go on to 6. For instance, today on my way home, on my way here to America's Got Talent, my mom screamed out the front door. What did she scream? Now there's an example of direct speech. Now that has to be paratactic projection. Okay. A is projecting. 6B, 6C, and D, the whole thing, that's all in quotes, that's all what was projected. And of course, we can analyze then those clauses, B, C, and D, and how they're related. Make sure that we have a that clause, and then we have 6D, a when, likely to be enhancement then. Let me just shift immediately to the table. So as I said, B, make sure. Now I put make sure that, and I put C and D, that you call me when you get there, Pookie. That is the projected, and I take the make sure as a kind of projecting clause. A, take that to be, again, as I said, it's a paratactic projection. You can see it there. A, what did his mother say? And then in direct quotes. So it's direct speech. Another question that was asked me was what about the difference between direct speech and what if it's a mental process and you have a that clause? Again, it's projecting, and again, we're more or less, the way the way the grammar works is that more or less speech and thought we treat them the same way. All right. 7, and like I get, and there again, I get, that's the projecting clause. What do I get? Why? My mother says it out of courtesy. I understand. Why? Now, yes, it's not a that clause, but it is what's understood. All right, and it is expressed with a WH word. Why? So I take that dependent clause here to be not an enhancement. It's what you understand. So therefore, it is a kind of projection. Why my mother says it out of courtesy, again, it can't stand alone. So it's a dependent clause, so it is hypotactic. It's a hypotactic projection. 8, notice how I put A as sort of the beta clause, but to be real, I'm taking as it's a dependent clause. It's a to infinitive, non-finite clause. A is the beta clause. I don't understand. B, don't understand, again, why my mom's so concerned with my safety. Again, if I treat 7, get, it's the same idea as what he's expressing in 8. 8, he uses the word understand, but in 7, he's using another word which basically means the same thing. So B is, again, projecting. Why my mom's so concerned with my safety. 9, praying for me, non-finite clause, obviously dependent clause, as I leave the house on a daily basis. All right, now, the question might be, how do we see the relationship? As I leave the house on a daily basis. Now, another way to treat this would be to, rather than as an elaboration, I took A as the dependent clause, the beta clause, elaborating on what happens as I leave the house. All right, so as I leave the house on a daily, I'm taking to be sort of in this relationship. As I leave the house daily, what's happening? Praying for me. Now, the other way to see this would be, and which would be quite all right as well, would be to see it as 9b as a kind of enhancement. But then you'll be taking the dependent clause, A, as the alpha clause, praying for me, as I leave the house on a daily basis. That could be seen as the enhancement. I could see, usually when I see an ing clause, an ing verb, I take that to be a kind of elaboration. As I leave the house on a daily basis, what's happening? Praying for me. No. Again, the way we're looking at this, we could argue the difference, but I think both would be. I would take both as acceptable. All right. Definitely, the as would suggest a kind of enhancement. I agree. I take that point. 10. Well, there's a lot there, but most of it is rank shifted. Most of it is. It isn't. They aren't dependent clauses. They're embedded. So in that sense, they are not to be analyzed here. We are only analyzing clause level and above, nothing that's rank shifted. 11 is, again, a simple clause. 12, well, let's look at that when we look at the table, all right? So 10, basically simple with a lot of embedding. 11, simple. 12. Now, I'm curious, 10 and 11. The idea that there's here this sort of, we get to this point, 10, 11, both simple. Yeah, you could argue 10 has a lot of embedding, but it's not, no clauses are joined here. That would be one observation to be making. When it comes to 12, then I went on Facebook. Okay, so, and you see over in the extension column, all right, and, so it's clearly an extension, and, so B and C, that I realize that my mama loved me the same way that every other mother loved their son. Well, B is projecting, realized, what? C, and then embedded in that is D. That's pretty straightforward, right? 13, again, simple. Those would stand out to me, all right? Again, as I've said. 14, I mean, I'm from Southside Stockton. Again, it's simple. We'll get to a point in a moment which we'll see in terms of how we'll put it into the table. 15, again, I'm looking at something that has basically got an embedding within it. Otherwise, clausally simple. 16, simple. So we're noticing in the middle of this text that there is not much going on in terms of parataxis and hypotaxis. That's something I think we'd need to be paying attention to. When we get back to 17, well, there we again get more going on. 17, again, there's quite a lot here. So let's look at it in the context with the table. And as I stared at the screen, okay, so again, I'm taking that as an enhancement. B and the rest that follows is what's happening as I stared at the screen. All right, so the A is in the beta column, the B through D, et cetera, is in the alpha column. I couldn't help but think. This one was a curious one too. And that was how to treat the I couldn't help but think. Most would consider this to be an idiomatic phrase. In other words, there was no, there's a compulsion. I have to see it this way, all right? I couldn't help but think. Should we treat it as one clause and sort of a very idiomatic combination of verbs with a conjunction? In other words, should we treat it sort of as an idiom, lexically, more or less as a unit? That would be certainly one way to approach it. I didn't do that here. I took B and C as a kind of extension because of the but. C through D is but think, and think is the projecting clause, and D with all the rest that follows the projected. All right. 18. Let's look at it in the context here. A, in that moment, I better understood that my black mother's greatest fear was, and then all that follows. All right. So again, A is I understood. The alpha and it's projecting, and the beta is the projected, and that's B and everything that follows. So yes, my mother's greatest fear is that I won't return home breathing, blood pulsing through these veins enough to still be her Pookie. And my mama warned me. And then we have another example of direct speech. All right, so 19, it gets a bit more complicated. And I did make an adjustment to this as I was looking at it further from what I had uploaded previously. So let me point out to you what I've done here. Let's take it from the beginning. So yes, my mother's greatest fear is, etc., etc. That's A. And then what follows, B through E. All right. And that is in the, as you can see, is in the I put it in the wrong column. A should be, and then following F through J, that is and. I should have put that in the extension column. You see that? I think you see what I'm talking about. A through E, that is should not be in the enhancement column. It should be in the extended column, because F and follows thereafter. All right, so please, I'm sorry that I thought I had caught the bugs in this before, but that is wrong. All right, that should be in the extension. A through E in the paratactic extension. Because of the and, F through J follows thereafter. F, and my mama warned me. Well, there is. Now, what was I thinking in this as boy, I got these really mixed up. Terrible. My mama warned me. What? It should be projection, right? F. And my mama warned me. What did she warn me? That should be a. How did I put that again in the wrong column? Both of these. Now, I must have been, as I was doing it, not looking at what was above. F, G through J should be in the. This is, again, kind of paratactic projection. It should be moved over into the previous column, and the enhancements should be moved over into the previous column. I somehow must have gotten them put into the wrong, figured in the wrong columns. I should have been looking at the header above it. I think you can see the correction that needs to be made. And you can see I need to move them both over, one category over, and each of them the same way. All right, because F is clearly projecting, and it's clearly a case of paratactic projection. G and H. Did I get these in the right column? Let's see. This is a kind of enhancement. That's fine. I and J. Again, that's a kind of, I need you to return home my Pookie again, kind of enhancement. And over on the extension side, G through H, joined with I and J by and, all right? So G and H, son, don't dare get caught at the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong colored skin, because those three strikes, they leave the pine box convictions. 19, I and I need you to return home my Pookie again. So we need to fix those two parts there. The columns should have had them over in the previous category. All right, now I can see why I had it in the enhancement. I meant to be in the extension and then just followed with the other one that should have been in the paratactic projection. 20. All right, so what have we got here? 20, again, B and C. Let's see, I will do everything in my power. C, to make it back home. All right, that's a clear case of enhancement. A, I promise you this. I will do everything in my power to make it back home to you. All right, I will do everything in my power. Arguable, you could have said perhaps that it is also, I promise you this, because you're like talking to your mother and this is what I'm saying, I will do this. This also could have been in the paratactic projection. 21, let's see, if I don't, 21A, enhancement, if, condition. B through D is in the alpha column for the enhancement. Just know 20B is a kind of projection, projecting C and D. You was always the very last thing on my mind, and I will always be your Pookie. Again, looking at this, I think if I were, I would change those projections to be paratactic projections, because it's really what he's saying. It's not indirect, it's direct. B through D and A, we did that already. C and B, U is always the very last thing on my mind. And, all right, C and B, C and D are extension to make it back home to you. C, and just know. B and C, let me see. All right, yes. B and D, let's see, just know. If I don't, yes, that's the enhancement. B is the projecting, C and D, and C and D is the extension. All right. Yeah. I received some comments from you guys that it's hard work, and it is. It is difficult to sort of look at how logically all this is put together in the way that it is. Just be sure to put them in the right columns, all right, when you do so. All right, let's move on. All right, let's move on to, let's see, 7:30. We still have time. Let's do the Nixon inauguration, second inauguration, and the parataxis versus hypotaxis. Again, this was the kind of thing we've been expecting, and as we've said, this is typical of a spoken, not a spoken word performance, but a speech that has been read to be spoken. It has all the characteristics of writing in the sense of it being more hypotactic. But it is in a way, and that's why there are speech writers, done in a way that will enable it to be listened to and to be able to be followed and to be understood. And what contributes to that? What contributes to that is the kinds of things we've been looking at, thematic progression. You'll notice that paragraph 3 ends with peace in the world. In paragraph 4, the peace we seek in the world. It picks up on what was just mentioned. What did we call that? Linear thematic projection. Linear thematic progression, excuse me. So 4 is going to elaborate. Paragraphs 4 through 11 will elaborate further on what was mentioned here, peace in the world. Let's listen to this.
This past year saw far-reaching results from our new policies for peace. By continuing to revitalize our traditional friendships and by our missions to Peking and to Moscow, we were able to establish the base for a new and more durable pattern of relationships among the nations of the world. Because of America's bold initiatives, 1972 will be long remembered as the year of the greatest progress since the end of World War II toward a lasting peace in the world. The peace we seek in the world is not the flimsy peace which is merely an interlude between wars, but a peace which can endure for generations to come.
Okay. I did have a question on chat just now about what's the difference, hypotactic and paratactic, and how do you tell the difference? I'll come back to that. Let me finish this part first. It's a question others of you might have as well, so let me come back to that, and I will respond to that after we finish this part here. What I'm trying to get at here is what it is that enables us to listen to something that is clearly written to be spoken. All right, it is not written to be read. It's written to be, well, read aloud, yes, spoken out. It's written as a speech. And that's different than if you get a textbook and you open it up and you read the textbook. That's not written to be spoken aloud, right? What's the difference? One of these is the thematic progression. Helps us to see the flow of information, and that's what we need to see. We need to be able to detect, and how we detect that is we listen what comes toward the end as new information, and what follows then in the next sentence, we take it to be something we've heard already. And in this case, paragraph 4 begins to talk about this piece that just was mentioned and elaborates on it. Now, in paragraph 4 and 5, how do we make the connection? What would be the relationship here? Here, I'm saying that there's a relationship of enhancement, not between clauses, not just between clauses, but between blocks of sentences. Example, paragraph 4. He's talking about we'll listen to it in a minute. He's talking about the limitations of America's role in maintaining that peace, and then goes on to say, unless America works to preserve peace, there'll be no peace, etc. And then in 5, though, comes across but. Well, that but is sort of with whatever was said in 4, which is several sentences. The but here signals a relationship between that and what is to follow. Conceding, yes, the truth of what was said in 4, but not to deny 4, to accept it, to take it, validate it, at the same time saying paragraph 5 in some ways supersedes it. That's what's concession. And so conjunction is another way that the signals are gotten across to us about what is a coherent text.
It is important that we understand both the necessity and the limitations of America's role in maintaining that peace. Unless we in America work to preserve the peace, there will be no peace. Unless we in America work to preserve freedom, there will be no freedom. But let us clearly understand the new nature of America's role as a result of the new policies we have adopted over these past 4 years.
Okay, new nature, new policies. Well, that means what we've just been hearing was the old. All right, so this is something new. But signal that concession. Conceding 4, yes, that was the old way. 5 now is the new way. Now 6, 7, 8, 9. What signals do we get as to how it's structured? Well, clearly the continuous thematic progression. We shall, we shall, we shall, we shall. We have seen this in other speeches as well. Remember Hu Jintao's state visit and repeating again, sentence after sentence, repeating the same beginning. Those repetitions, that continuous thematic progression signals not only that 6, 7, 8, and 9 are one block, but it signals a sort of kind of parataxis. What is parataxis? Parataxis is when there is a kind of balance, there's a kind of symmetry, because both sides are equal, and in the sense we're discussing, equal grammatically. Okay, what have we seen? Let's listen.
But let us clearly understand the new nature of America's role as a result of the new policies we have adopted over these past 4 years. We shall respect our treaty commitments. We shall support vigorously the principle that no country has the right to impose its will or rule on another by force. We shall continue in this era of negotiation to work for the limitation of nuclear arms and to reduce the danger of confrontation between the great powers. We shall do our share in defending peace and freedom in the world, but we shall expect others to do their share.
Okay, so what we've looked at, 3 ways in which we have looked, the coherent relations have been signaled to us. Linear thematic progression. Ending paragraph 3 on peace in the world, and paragraph 4 picks it up right away and begins to obviously elaborate it in what follows, but signals that there is a change, not a contrast, but conceding, yes, for, not to deny it, but that was the old way, here is the new way. And then 6, 7, 8, 9, that continuous thematic progression. So thematic progression, conjunction, all help to be able to get across to the listener what is the coherent structuring of the text. So we are using rhetorical structure theory. We map out what are the relations. And you'll notice that I've used the relations Halliday's relations here to indicate sort of the idea. Now, instead of as I've been picturing it here, as you can see, where we had paragraph 3, then related by elaboration with 4 through 11, and then 4 with 5 through 11 and on, I sort of turned that upside down. Why? Because I wanted to sort of see it like building something. I wanted to sort of to get across more or less this metaphor that I've been using with you of architecture. You're building something when you're putting together a text. And what we're doing is, when we come through with our linguistic analysis, is to again see that kind of logical structuring, not just between clauses, but to see it as between blocks of text in a sort of hierarchical organization. So in this sense, we begin as sort of the bottom is the text as a whole, and then we're just looking at how it was sort of, how we could sort of deconstruct it. And on the basis of that, look at how it builds. What we see is basically a text that progresses. It's building up to an idea. When I look at this within the context of the whole speech, and I do my RST analysis of the whole speech, and I have my map, I begin to see that these paragraphs 3 through 11 sort of are building a particular idea, which then seems to change, which then seems to go on to something else. But there's another clue here that that's what's actually happening. And this time I've turned the architecture, the map on its side, because I want to show you something. What do you see in terms of a repetition? Let us. You see let us throughout the whole speech, except in this one block, paragraph 3 through 11, only once. But throughout the rest of the speech, almost every paragraph includes this let us, let us. That's, if I talk about this in terms of texture, I'd say that the text itself has a kind of lexical cohesion involving let us, except for this one, where it's paragraph 3 through 11. Now, an important point when you are looking at the patterning, sometimes it's not just something that it keeps occurring. A pattern can be sometimes the absence of something. And in this case, the pattern in 3 through 11, well, it's a different pattern than the rest of the text. And it's defined in a way by the absence of let us. So sometimes you look for, when you're looking at the patterns that you see in the text, you need to notice not only those where something is repeated, but you need to notice where sometimes what you expect and what may be there throughout the rest of the text or isn't there. It's not just the choices of what you do, it's also the choices of what you didn't do that matter. They mean something. The texture. What do I mean by texture? Goes back to what we talked about, cohesiveness. And what's cohesiveness? You remember the things that we mentioned, lexical cohesion, substitution, ellipsis, conjunction. All of these, yes, contribute to the cohesiveness of the text. Metaphorically, I want to use another term, the texture. On the basis of the texture, we identify sort of the blocks that make up, the segments that make up the text as a whole, as it builds. What is the result is the architecture. All right, now, before I go on to the next topic, and we'll pause here because it is the time for a break. One of the questions was paratactic versus hypotactic. On the one hand, it's sometimes, and if I may, I'm going to go back a bit to what we were looking at, some of the. Now, if any of you have a particular question about paratactic, hypotactic from this text, do let me know. But let me just try to illustrate some of the examples. Now, 17a, why would I take as I stared at the screen as a kind of followed by I couldn't help but think? Why would I take the 17a followed by B and C? Why would I take the dependent? Why would I take this as hypotaxis? Because 17a is clearly a dependent clause. All right, there's no question about it. It can't stand alone. It needs to be joined with another clause to make it complete. How do I know? Well, the as is a giveaway, all right? That tells me if I have a conjunction like is, when, as, these conjunctions, all of them tell me that there needs to be something else come alongside it. It's a dependent clause. That's obvious hypotaxis. Okay, now let me get to now remember, there was an issue here. I questioned my analysis here of the projection. What I have here on the analysis is A, so dear mom, I promise you this, and the projected B through Z. I said that's hypotactic projection. Right now, I don't think so. Why don't I think so? Because it's really direct speech. It's really what he's saying. I will do everything in my power to make it back home to you. He's talking directly to his mother. Direct speech, direct thought. What you normally would put in quotation marks, but here is not. But that doesn't mean it isn't. That would be paratactic, because the direct speech is not a that clause. Hypotaxis typically indicates that one clause is not equal grammatically to the other. One is dependent. It can be a verb with ing. All right? That would be a dependent clause. Now, there was an interesting example here, and that, let me see if I could come back to that. Yeah, I was, one that bugged me a bit was 9, all right? Because praying for me is a dependent clause, and as I leave the house on a daily. The point is, none of it is a complete sentence, all right? Really. It's a punctuated sentence here, but you have 2 dependent clauses combined together. So it depends on which you're going to sort of take as being, is it going to be an elaboration? A is elaborating B, or is it going to be an enhancement? B is enhancing A. You can sort of pick and choose. They are both dependent clauses. One is an ing verb, the other begins with as. So whichever you choose, that's sort of however you want to interpret it. It's not really a well-formed sentence. All right? It is really, both are dependent clauses. Now, 8, for example, to be real. That obviously it's a non-finite clause. Now, do you know what I mean by finite and non-finite? Finite is where you have tense. You have primary tense, past tense, or present tense. A non-finite clause doesn't show you tense. It could be a to infinitive. It could be an ing verb. In some way, it doesn't show you tense. All right? Lacks primary tense. That non-finite clause is a dependent clause and is going to be related to another clause. It will be definitely hypotactic. So that's if there's a specific question about one of these that came up, or another sentence that you have in mind that you're wondering about, and why is it, what's the difference, paratactic, hypotactic, how do you decide? If there's a specific question, do let me know in the chat, or if I've explained it well enough, that would be good too. Okay, now it's 7:55. Break begins, all right? So let's have our break, and we'll come back at 5 past the hour. Okay, are we good? Let's continue. And what I'd like to look at with you right now is another example of Again, someone who's typically considered to be an outstanding speaker, and that would be Steve Jobs. He's someone that, whether he was presenting uh, a new Apple product, or whether he was giving a commencement address like we will see in a moment, uh, his speaking style is considered to be a very good one. He's able to get across his message. So let's take a look at how he delivered this commencement address. And as you can see, as I just showed you, it's there, up there with David Foster Wallace in terms of top 10 commencement speeches. David Foster Wallace's was very different. Steve Jobs is more what one would expect from a commencement speech. Now, it was well crafted. There was definitely a design here in terms of how it was put together. We have, and these comments have been made about it. First of all, the people have noticed the rule of three. We've looked at that before. You can see it in speeches all over where people repeat things in 3 times, all right? Not the same thing, but variations on it. So I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great, about. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle. 3 things. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment, of failure. 3 things. It means. Your time is limited, so don't waste living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let. So don't. So it really, and throughout the speech, Steve Jobs repeats 3 times, stay hungry, stay foolish. I mean, that's something where you can tell this was deliberate. And it's a technique. It's a well-known technique in terms of speaking. All right, so it's by design. But there are other features too. We've talked about antithesis as a kind of relation in rhetorical structure theory. It does mean a sort of a contrast of ideas. And in this case, dropped out, dropped in, dropped out, dropped in, looking forward, looking backward, the heaviness, the lightness, dead, life, old, new. So you have all these sort of juxtaposed together, these contrasting words. And it does lend itself to a kind of sort of parallel kind of structure. So that was another aspect of what we see in the speech repeatedly. I've done a word cloud, and life, college, Apple. These were the words that come through if I take a word cloud as a whole commencement speech. Now I've broken it down into 3 parts. Now why is that, and what motivation do I have to do that? Well, the fact was his speech is really composed as 3 stories. And he puts it across like this. This is my first story. This is my second story. This is my third story. And so I looked at each. I mean, that's a very clear kind of structuring, all right, that he announces. And if we take a look at the word cloud for these, then college, Apple, death. It does sort of tell us something about what the text is about. You might say, why do I always do word clouds? Well, I usually do when I approach a text for the first time, just to see in terms of words what just sort of emerges as a kind of focus. And that you can see from words that occur most prominently, most frequently. And those are the words that are larger, right, in a word cloud. So I do it just to give myself a sense of what the text, what's going on with the text. It's the first pattern, but it's not related to the grammar. It's related more to the lexis, the words.
Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life. That's it. No big deal. Just 3 stories. The first story is about connecting the dots. I dropped out of Reed College after the first 6 months, but then stayed around as a drop-in for another 18 months or so before I really quit. So why'd I drop out? It started before I was born. My biological mother was a young, unwed graduate student, and she decided to put me up for adoption. She felt very strongly that I should be adopted by college graduates, so everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer and his wife. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute that they really wanted a girl. So my parents, who were on a waiting list, got a call in the middle of the night asking, "We've got an unexpected baby boy. Do you want him?" They said, "Of course." My biological mother found out later that my mother had never graduated from college and that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused to sign the final adoption papers. She only relented a few months later when my parents promised that I would go to college. This was the start in my life. And 17 years later, I did go to college. But I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford. And all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was, spending all of the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. It was pretty scary at the time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked far more interesting. It wasn't all romantic. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in friends' rooms. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with. And I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give you one example. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, every poster, every label on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I had dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it all into the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. If I had never dropped out, I would have never dropped in on that calligraphy class, and personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever, because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart even when it leads you off the well-worn path, and that will make all the difference.
Okay, so that's the first story. And I followed my usual way of analyzing it, transitivity analysis, looking at the process types, and I found that it's largely doing, 56%, some mental, very few verbal, some relational processes, but more material. All right? Second story.
My second story is about love and loss. I was lucky. I found what I loved to do early in life. Woz and I started Apple in my parents' garage when I was 20. We worked hard, and in 10 years, Apple had grown from just the two of us in a garage into a $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. We just released our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I just turned 30. And then I got fired. How can you get fired from a company you started? Well, as Apple grew, we hired someone who I thought was very talented to run the company with me. And for the first year or so, things went well. But then our visions of the future began to diverge, and eventually we had a falling out. When we did, our board of directors sided with him. And so at 30, I was out, and very publicly out. What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone, and it was devastating. I really didn't know what to do for a few months. I felt that I had let the previous generation of entrepreneurs down, that I had dropped the baton as it was being passed to me. I met with David Packard and Bob Noyce and tried to apologize for screwing up so badly. I was a very public failure, and I even thought about running away from the valley. But something slowly began to dawn on me. I still loved what I did. The turn of events at Apple had not changed that one bit. I'd been rejected, but I was still in love. And so I decided to start over. I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. During the next 5 years, I started a company named Next, another company named Pixar, and fell in love with an amazing woman who would become my wife. Pixar went on to create the world's first computer animated feature film, Toy Story, and is now the most successful animation studio in the world. In a remarkable turn of events, Apple bought Next, and I returned to Apple, and the technology we developed at Next is at the heart of Apple's current renaissance. And Lorene and I have a wonderful family together. I'm pretty sure none of this would have happened if I hadn't been fired from Apple. It was awful tasting medicine, but I guess the patient needed it. Sometimes life's going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. You've got to find what you love, and that is as true for work as it is for your lovers. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking and don't settle. As with all matters of the heart, you'll know when you find it. And like any great relationship, it just gets better and better as the years roll on. So keep looking, don't settle.
All right, now, that's the second story. By the way, have you begun to notice something else? Not about transitivity, but have you begun to notice that it's largely telling his stories, right? So what would you expect? It should be first person. It's his narrative. It's his story. Do you notice what happens, though, at the end of each story? You begin to get these imperatives. Don't settle. You begin to get the second person address, you. So each story sort of winds down to in the same way, excuse me, sort of winds into the same pattern. It's intended to be motivational, based on, yes, his narrative, but at the end of each of these, notice how it shifts to this, from first person to second person, from statements to imperatives. The second story, again, I'm just sort of following through here, and again, I'm looking at the process types, and okay, material process, 51%, relational a bit more, and no verbal processes, but it's sort of maintaining at the same sort of direction. All right. Third story.
My third story is about death. When I was 17, I read a quote that went something like, "If you live each day as if it was your last, someday you'll most certainly be right." It made an impression on me, and since then, for the past 33 years, I've looked in the mirror every morning and asked myself, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I am about to do today? And whenever the answer has been no for too many days in a row, I know I need to change something. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart. About a year ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. I had a scan at 7:30 in the morning, and it clearly showed a tumor on my pancreas. I didn't even know what a pancreas was. The doctors told me this was almost certainly a type of cancer that is incurable, and that I should expect to live no longer than 3 to 6 months. My doctor advised me to go home and get my affairs in order, which is doctor's code for prepare to die. It means to try and tell your kids everything you thought you'd have the next 10 years to tell them in just a few months. It means to make sure everything is buttoned up so that it will be as easy as possible for your family. It means to say your goodbyes. I lived with that diagnosis all day. Later that evening, I had a biopsy where they stuck an endoscope down my throat, through my stomach and into my intestines, put a needle into my pancreas and got a few cells from the tumor. I was sedated, but my wife, who was there, told me that when they viewed the cells under a microscope, the doctors started crying because it turned out to be a very rare form of pancreatic cancer that is curable with surgery. I had the surgery, and thankfully, I'm fine now. This was the closest I've been to facing death, and I hope it's the closest I get for a few more decades. Having lived through it, I can now say this to you with a bit more certainty than when death was a useful but purely intellectual concept. No one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet, death is the destination we all share. No one has ever escaped it. And that is as it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. Right now, the new is you. But someday, not too long from now, you will gradually become the old and be cleared away. Sorry to be so dramatic, but it's quite true. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary.
All right, that's the third story. So you've heard the three stories now. Again, more relational processes, fewer doing, mental still right about the same, and a bit more speaking here, more verbal processes. We notice that there is less doing. That was interesting. But I also noticed as I'm listening to it that I keep hearing I. All right. And as I said, it's his first person narrative. It's expected at commencement speeches. That's why you get this well-known personality, this person who is successful. They're to tell their story, and by so doing, motivate these graduates to go on to do their own successful thing. And so, yes, it's not unlikely that I keeps being repeated in all three stories. But what I was interested in was, where was I the initiator? I is the doer. Not just first person, because first person can include me and my and so forth, but really just I, which would be likely the subject, and it would be the doer, the initiator. In the case of material processes, I, in the first story, 33%. The second story, he gets fired, 20%. I, in the third story, notice I is becoming less the doer. Why? Because he's less in control. When he got fired from Apple, he wasn't in control. It wasn't up to him. When it came time to get this diagnosis of cancer and the possibility of death, again, he was not in control. And so we notice that when we look at the process, we look at the type of ongoing, what processes are being done. It's not just the process types by themselves. It's also, we get a picture of how this story is developing as we see that even though it's the doing, he is less the doer. And as we proceed through the text, as we progress through it, he is becoming less and less in control of what's taking place. And that's reflected then in these numbers that we see here. All right, let me look at it from the standpoint of parataxis, hypotaxis. And again, I'm going to compare it in terms of, so let's take the first category here, simple versus complex clauses. And I notice that in the first stories, 21% simple. Second story, 24%. Third story, the least number of simple clauses. When there are complex clauses, you know what that means? You have a sentence with more than one clause, right? Involving either parataxis or hypotaxis. You can see the numbers, 38 to 62. Well, that's similar to what we saw with other speeches by Obama, by Nixon, and so on. And the same is true in the third story. The odd one out here is the second story. The second story, it's almost half-half. You notice, do you remember his first inaugural address, and how it was criticized because it was too paratactic? And remember, those numbers were almost the same like what we see here. The second story is different than either the first or the third. Now, let's factor in the projection. And so I'm going to sort of take projection out of the picture and sort of put it in a category by itself. Where was projection either related to mental processes or verbal processes? And that we notice in, if I take that out of the mix, so to speak, then we see the first story, 27 to 49. Third story, 32 to 55. The second story, the parataxis just jumps out. It's way more paratactic, the second story, than either the first or the third story. It has a different texture. It's somehow different than either of the others. Okay, so I've my rhetorical structure mapping of what's going on. Let me sort of explain somehow how I arrived at least part of this. Let's take the first story. All right, so to begin with, it announces the first story is about connecting the dots. And the rest of the story follows in 3 through 9. All right, these are paragraphs. All right. Paragraphs 3 through 9 just sort of tell the story. So I'm taking 2. Now you could say, why isn't it the other way around? Why not 2 is providing the background for the main part? Well, I felt that the beginning part was, this is the story, and giving the title of the story. The rest will then follow and elaborate what that story is. So at this point, it's more or less how I see what is the nucleus. Yeah, I took the nucleus to be the announcement of the story, and the rest of the story is what follows. All right, so that's how I drew it here. And likewise at the end, paragraph 9, again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. Well, that's coming up to sort of the motivating part, right? And that is supposed to be the part that's being conveyed to the audience, and it's all the second person. All right, you can only you have to trust it has made all the difference in my life. Okay, yeah, still has some first person, but notice overall it's no longer about I, it's about you. All right, so 3 through 8 is meant to motivate. Now 3, and he signals this pretty obviously, because in 3 he ends with question. So why did I drop out? So he's posing a question. The solution is in 4 through 8, and that will tell us why he dropped out. 4 ends with someday go to college. 5, and 17 years later, I did go to college. And so then it again sort of introduces, I will someday go to college. And then what was that set the sort of background for what will follow now, 5 through 8, and that is going to college. And so again, that's sort of a thematic progression. Someday go to college, 17 years later, I did go to college. Now you might say, well, that's not the theme though. What I'm looking at though is more a kind of thematic progression between paragraphs, between larger chunks, not just between the separate clauses. And so I am being a bit more flexible here in how I'm seeing the relation. I see it ending on college, and I see the next paragraph beginning with college. The first sentence more or less setting the theme for what will follow. 5, paragraph 5. I took it to be sort of the main paragraph of the whole first story. You know, I noticed something as I was going through it. I noticed that he doesn't use the word best a lot, but he uses it once, at least once, in every story. In one story, he used best twice. And here is the best decisions, only once in this story. In other words, he doesn't use best very often. And to me, as I sort of looked at how it was laid out, the architecture, and looked at how the text was put together, I began to notice that the best was typically in sort of that, if I followed all the lines, this would take me to sort of what was the main paragraph of each story. 17 years later, I did go to college, but I naively chose a college, and then he goes on to tell. And then paragraph 6, you'll notice it wasn't all romantic. And here he describes what happens when he went to college, right? And it's it. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor. I returned Coke bottles. It goes on to explain and elaborate what there was that was happening when he did go to college. But it was that decision that he made. 6 through 8. Now, is there a way to, again, see, is there a signal here as to how it's structured? Well, there again, 6. Let me give you an example. And obviously 7 and 8 then follow on with what that example is. And he's illustrating here why it was beneficial, the choice that he made to drop out. And this is what has followed thereafter. 7 talks about Reed College, and then it gets to what impact that had on his life. So this was sort of how again, when you're doing a rhetorical structure analysis, this sort of, again, remember, it's sort of like your theory of how the text means what it does in a sort of coherent structuring. And I've tried to give evidence for why I made the decisions that I made. And that's sort of what a rhetorical structure analysis is. It's meant to be how you interpreted the text. It reflects the text as a semantic unit, how you interpreted it as being put together. And now, it's not just ad hoc. There are signals. There are indications why you've made the choices you've made. Could it be made differently? Yes, I don't doubt that it could be. As I said right away at the beginning, you could say that paragraph 2 isn't the sort of core of it. It's sort of just, again, providing a background for what follows. Yeah, equally, you could argue that. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to sort of build up what is sort of the architecture and see the whole thing put together. And so that would be the first story. Then we see the second story. And finally, the last story as well. You notice the first story is a bit more progressive. It's a bit more building. And the second and the third story, more paratactic. But causally, remember, the second story was largely much more paratactic. What that tells you is that in the writing of these stories, whether it's Steve Jobs himself, and I'm sure he had a very big part in it, if not all of it, they are different. They don't have the same sort of style, each of them. And the one that's the second story about getting fired from Apple, interestingly, that story sort of stands out as being very much more paratactic, very much more like, what have we said before? When are we more paratactic? We're more paratactic when we're just speaking, right? When our thoughts are just sort of, it's not sort of how they developed. Well, to me, it seems that the first story, his beginnings, there was a clear sort of development in how he developed his interests and how those progressed. In the second story, he gets fired. In the third story, he faces death. the second and third story are different. They had different impacts on his life. I was interested. I just sort of mapped out to see what was the case of the second person. All right. You'll notice where does it sort of pop up. All right. And it sort of seems to pop up again strikingly, paragraph 15. Paragraph 15, that would be at the end of the second story. And there again, you'll notice that it obviously stands out as being addressed to you, to his audience. Well, now, when we looked at David Foster Wallace, now I want you to think about a text like this. Remember, David Foster Wallace's was also considered by Time magazine to be sort of at the top. And let me just remind you what Time magazine said. This address at Kenyon was vintage Wallace. And Wallace was this postmodern writer, remember? Smart, occasionally meandering discussion of the issues that consumed him, from the banality of life to the meaning of consciousness. I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy and grandly inspirational, he concluded. What it is, so far as I can see, is the truth, the capital T truth. It's about life before death. It's about making it to 30 or maybe 50 without wanting to shoot yourself in the head. All the reasons Wallace didn't make it to 50 are apparent here. This is Time magazine commenting. In hindsight, the speech reads like the first draft of a suicide note for an author who took his own life last year at age 46. It's a macabre read. There's tons that's worthwhile here. The speech crackles with wit, intelligence, and offers tricks for escaping the depression to which Wallace ultimately succumbed.
Greetings, thanks, and congratulations to Kenyon's graduating class of 2005. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" This is a standard requirement of U.S. commencement speeches, the deployment of didactic little parable-ish stories. The story thing turns out to be one of the better, less bullshitty conventions of the genre. But if you're worried that I plan to present myself here as the wise older fish explaining what water is to you younger fish, please don't be. I am not the wise old fish.
I'm not the wise old fish. Very different in the sense of with Steve Jobs, he was the wise older fish, all right? He was telling his audience what they were supposed to be doing. And at times, David Foster Wallace says, I'm not telling you what to think, but then all of it, most of the speech is about what to think, right?
Perhaps the most sad and poignant of my examples tonight, and this is, I always shudder a little bit when I read it, is David Foster Wallace, who was a great writer. He was a novelist, an American novelist. At least I don't have any idea, frankly, how well known he was across the world. But in America, he was one of the leading lights of postmodern novelists and writers. And he was highly respected and loved. A couple of years ago, he committed suicide in his late 40s. Not too long before he committed suicide, he gave a commencement address at a liberal arts college. And this commencement address, as soon as it was given, was noted by many people as being unusual because David Foster Wallace, like a lot of postmodern writers, is impenetrable. He's a very hard, when you read his work, you have no idea what it means, and you're supposed to sit and discuss it and think about it, and that's it, that's the point. Many folks pointed out that this commencement speech was very, very lucid, unusually lucid and direct. And accessible, but it was not long before he killed himself. And listen to this.
Now, very, very lucid, not like his normal style. Now, I mentioned something to you before when we were talking about Nixon. Do you remember what I said? Sometimes the pattern, sometimes what you're looking for is what doesn't come up to your expectations, what isn't what you expected, what the choice that was made not to do something. And what I'm here noticing in David Foster Wallace's speech, what is important are the choices that he is making, not to sort of meet our expectations. When he gives his speech, there are these, and I mentioned it before, there are these, and you see it in Steve Jobs as well. This is not a matter of virtue. A short, brief, very short sentence. Then it's followed by something which is much longer and more lexically dense and more clausally complex, in which he makes his main point. But it's, as I pointed out previously to you, there are these sort of valleys and peaks.
Please don't worry that I'm getting ready to lecture you about compassion or other directedness or all the so-called virtues. This is not a matter of virtue. It's a matter of my choosing to do the work of somehow altering or getting free of my natural, hardwired default setting, which is to be deeply and literally self-centered, and to see and interpret everything through this lens of self. People who can adjust their natural default setting this way are often described as being well-adjusted, which I suggest to you is not an accidental term. Given the triumphant academic setting here, an obvious question is how much of this work of adjusting our default setting involves actual knowledge or intellect. This question gets very tricky. Probably the most dangerous thing about an academic education, at least in my own case, is that it enables my tendency to over-intellectualize stuff, to get lost in abstract arguments inside my head instead of simply paying attention to what's going on right in front of me, paying attention to what is going on inside me. Think of the old cliche about, quote, the mind being an excellent servant but a terrible master. This, like many cliches, so lame and unexciting on the surface, actually expresses a great and terrible truth. It is not the least bit coincidental that adults who commit suicide with firearms almost always shoot themselves in the head. They shoot the terrible master. And the truth is that most of these suicides are actually dead long before they pull the trigger. And I submit that this is what the real, no bullshit value of your liberal arts education is supposed to be about. How to keep from going through your comfortable, prosperous, respectable adult life dead, unconscious, a slave to your head and to your natural default setting of being uniquely, completely, imperially alone, day in and day out.
It's the anti-text. This is important because it's to say that it's a choice that's being made here. Now, when I say it's the anti-text, what do I mean? It comes from the idea Halliday's put forward about what is an anti-language. An anti-language arises, he says, when the alternative reality is a counter-reality, set up in opposition to some established norm. Well, there is a counter-reality that David Foster Wallace is trying to put forward. He's saying that our default setting, this hardwired default setting, is self-centeredness. And what he's trying to do is to counter that, alternative to that. Halliday continues, it is thus not the distance between the two realities, but the tension between them that is significant. The distance need not be very great. The one is, in fact, a metaphorical variant of the other. It's interesting.
I know that this stuff...
Metaphorical variant of the other. Go back to what we've been talking about de-automatization, the automatic. What is the automatic with respect to a commencement speech? What is it supposed to be like? And here, David Foster Wallace very deliberately is not presenting a commencement speech that they would be expecting to hear.
I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy or grandly inspirational the way a commencement speech is supposed to sound. What it is, as far as I can see, is the capital T truth with a whole lot of rhetorical niceties stripped away. You are, of course, free to think of it whatever you wish. But please don't just dismiss it as some finger-wagging Dr. Laura sermon. None of this stuff is really about morality or religion or dogma or big fancy questions of life after death. The capital T truth is about life before death. It is about the real value of a real education, which has almost nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with simple awareness. Awareness of what is so real and essential, so hidden in plain sight all around us all the time, that we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over, this is water. This is water. It is unimaginably hard to do this, to stay conscious and alive in the adult world day in and day out. Which means yet another grand cliche turns out to be true. Your education really is the job of a lifetime, and it commences now. I wish you way more than luck.
It is an anti-commencement speech. But to know that, you need to know what is a commencement speech, right? It is contrary to the genre. It is an anti-Wallace style. It's not his typical literary style. And what he's doing with this anti-commencement speech and this anti-Wallace style speech, everything is against the expectations. To do that, to advocate for a counter-reality. The whole text is a metaphor. The whole thing is a metaphor for what it is he's trying to say. But to know that, you've got to know what is the author's style, what is the genre, what is a commencement speech. He announces, though, to you, he says, I'm not the wise old fish. He says, this is not grandly inspirational. No, he was deliberate in choosing not to do something one way. So our choices are not just always what we do, it's also what we don't do that are meaningful, that say something. You might say, well, go back to Nixon, and why was that speech, why was that, those paragraphs, why were they such a different kind of speech? My guess is they were probably written differently, perhaps by another speechwriter or the same speechwriter at a different time than the rest of the speech. Because it looks like a completely different texture. I guess if you think of it in terms of a cloth, it's like you've sewn a patch on something, and it's a completely different kind of cloth, different pattern. Now, that speech that he gave in that second inaugural, 2 weeks later, he would announce peace with Vietnam. Perhaps that section on peace was intended to sort of to lead up to that announcement that was about to come, which obviously perhaps came out to them, they were aware of it after this rest of the speech had been written. But it shows. In a way, it's a kind of forensic kind of study. You know what forensics is, right? And you hear about it when you watch these crime shows, the forensic investigation. Well, that's sort of what you're doing here. You're looking at the text, you're looking at how it's put together, and the language is revealing different things about the text. The whole point of Wallace's was the need to de-automatize. And so what did he do? The whole speech is a de-automatization. The whole speech is a metaphor. I hope that having gone through this course, you're very well aware of this idea of the metaphor, the de-automatization, this understanding of a text as being an extended metaphor. We've looked at lexical metaphors, we've looked at grammatical metaphors, and you should be aware of the extended metaphor. Aware of what you are listening to and aware of what you're reading and aware of how it was put together. All right, now, well, it is, whoa, time's getting on. Now, I did want to make a point of something. And let me see if I can, let's see. Wrong thing. There we go. Okay, on Canvas. If you haven't already done this, would you please go to week 11. Week 11, you'll see that there is two folders, mock test Romney debate and mock test SBO Gold. All right. We're going to, if you open these up, you'll see that there is a grammatical analysis template for, let's open that up. This is obviously logical meaning. And then there's another one which is for theme and another's transitivity. And you'll see this mock exam. All right. Now, I'm going to stop here. When we come back, I'm going to walk with you through this mock exam with this SBO Gold. I've given you another one as well, which is from the Romney debate with Obama. We'll get to that in a moment. But what I want to do is walk you through the exam. And so it would be best if you sort of printed out these pages and were able to follow along rather than just on the screen, all right? At the very least, download what you see there and be able to bring it up in Word rather than in Canvas like this. All right, so could you please, if you haven't done that already, get that prepared in the break that we'll take now. It's around, it's nearly 9, so 8:58. About 10 minutes during the break, get your materials ready. Please, not just this one, the other one as well. This one is for the SBO Gold, and you see you have the Romney debate, and that likewise, the same thing. And let me talk with you through it. And what I asked you to do is, I told you what I want to do with you now, though, is I really wanted to walk you through this one, the SBO Gold, the mock test, sort of show you how I would proceed, go through it, how I would do it. And the other one is what I really wanted to do with the Romney one was to have you do it, try it, and then come back and talk about it and see what you came up with. All right. So let's see how much we get done in the next session, the next hour. And let's come back at 9:10. Okay. Okay. See you then. Okay, let's begin, and we'll begin with this first one. It was a business text. All right, it was written, it was students writing. You remember we talked about that we had a special program here to coach students to how to improve their writing. And this was a student's writing that had gone through several drafts, and this was sort of the final written assignment for the student. That's the text that we're analyzing. So if you have downloaded this, then what you'd be looking at would be this. So let me go through this. This was, now this is just a mock test, all right? I want to emphasize that point. And these mock are just meant for, as I said, they are like kind of practice, but they're also a learning exercise. So you'll see something somewhat like this. There are two sections to the exam, and you are to do both parts, part A and part B. It will be an open book examination, meaning you will be able to have access to all of your material and so forth, but it will be a text that you've not analyzed before, all right? It will be something new, all right? But, important point, you should always see your text in relation to other texts. You should see your text intertextually. So that if it is, for example, kind of academic writing. Well, we've talked about academic writing, and there should be some expectations on that you bring to what you will be looking at in terms of knowing what it's about. So in section A, you'll get a sort of this will be very similar kind of wording. Notice the section A, this part will be 60% of the exam. And it will go something like this. See the attached data tables for transitivity, logical, and theme rime analyses from the systemic functional analysis of the text below. Now, that will be the same. You will also see tables for transitivity, logical, theme rime. Now, by now, you should know how to read them. You put them together yourself, so you're familiar with what those look like. Then it will tell you what the text is, the nature of the text is taken from a university student's business assignment. That's important for you to be thinking about, okay, and you should already be bringing to it certain expectations that you've had based on the kinds of texts that you've analyzed in the class already. Okay? Now this will be what you need to write about. How has fit to context likely influenced the patterning you observe in the text? Comment on how patterning of choices in terms of lexicogrammatical features contributes to the cohesiveness and coherence of this text. If you disagree with a particular point in the analysis, you may note this in your comments. Now, that doesn't mean that I have specifically tried to introduce errors into the analysis that I'm expecting you to find, all right? If there's any error in the analysis, which definitely I go over it very closely, so I don't expect you should, but there may be some point of disagreement. That's fine to raise that in your comments here. There shouldn't be. The analysis will be as I believe it to be correct, okay? Just to clarify that point. Now remember, there's several parts here. One, it says, how has fit to context likely influenced the patterning you observe in the text? You need to look at this text. You're going to read the text. That should be the first step you do, all right? You should definitely read the text. You know that it's taken from a university student's business assignment. What are your expectations given what it's about the nature of who's writing. It's a student writing in response to an assignment for class. So it should be a kind of academic writing. So these are your expectations, all right, for what you would expect to be finding in the text that you're about to look at. How is fit to context likely influence the patterning you observe in the text? Given the register, field, tenor, mode. Now, don't spend long time to discuss what is field, what is tenor, what is mode. Don't give me the don't waste time and words on explaining concepts. Apply the concepts. That is what I will be looking for. But how you begin your assignment, how you begin this section, writing for this section, begin it by asking yourself, how does it conform to my expectations for what I should find? It could be that the text will not be what you would expect, given the topic, what it's about, given who is talking, given the context, given the register, the field, the tenor, the mode. That you should be, that's something that we've been saying already throughout this lecture today, right? Okay, so that's the first thing though. Bring to it immediately, what are your hypotheses? What are your expectations, given what you've already seen? And I encourage you strongly, refer to what we have looked at in class. I want to see that. I want to see that you've been noticing the kinds of texts that we've been looking at. Don't look at the text that you will be having on your exam as like, without, as though it has no relationship whatsoever to any text that you've looked at before. That would be a big mistake. Don't look at your text in isolation as though it is somehow an island that nothing comes near, okay? That's important. So start, fit to context. Next thing, patterning of choices. You're going to look for the patterns. Lexicogrammatical features. What do we mean? We mean exactly what's in those tables. For transitivity, for logical, for theme ream. How does it contribute to the cohesiveness? How else have I referred to it? Texture. Coherence. Again, do not give me lots of description about what does cohesiveness mean or what does coherence mean. Here, I'm not so interested in you talking about the concepts as I am the application. I'm interested in your observations. Your observations based on what you observe in those tables, the data. That whatever's in those tables is your data. All right, now you look at the text. And I'd like you just to take a moment now. I'd like you to look at the text, all right? I'm not going to read it, of course, but take a look at the text. And before we start to go ahead and look at the tables. That's the first thing. Do that. Okay, have you gone through the text? Now this should be the first First thing you do, read the text. When you start writing, be thinking about how you're going to frame it in the context of what you're writing. Just before I say any more about this, we'll come back to this, just a very brief mention. Section B, worth 40 points, 40%. This will be the essay part. This will be where you get conceptual. This is where you expect theory and things like that. You will get 2 questions. You will respond to one of them, all right? And I won't talk about that right here. I mean, the nature of the questions is similar to like what we've looked at in the midterm, all right? What is the difference between cohesion and coherence as properties of a text? What features in a text contribute to its cohesiveness and coherence? Well, certainly you've been asked to do that in the previous text, all right? So I would have certainly expected anyone who picked that to hear talk about the concept. What is cohesion? What is coherence? And to use, yes, examples from that text, but certainly not limited to that. I would certainly be going back over a text that you've analyzed, a text that I've discussed in lecture. That's why begin preparing now for your exam. Begin to start getting a feel for what kinds of texts have you been looking at. And do not plan to go back over the videos during the exam, all right? 2 hours, not 3 hours, 2 hours to do both parts. So even though it's open book, you don't have a lot of time to do searching through all your material. Be able to organize your material now in terms of the kinds of texts that you can then think about, okay, that one, these were the kinds of texts that we looked at in that lecture. These are the points that we made about it. Prepare yourself in that manner. All right, now that's the nature of the question paper itself. So let's go back. First thing, frame the text within the context of situation. What are your expectations, given the typical features of text in occurring in that context of situation? What are your expectations for the text in that context of situation? A student's writing, university setting. Remember, we did all that discussion about the academic writing. I introduced to you how we teach from a systemic functional perspective. Well, that would be certainly relevant here, all right? To go back and look at that rubric. What kinds of points were there that were mentioned as kinds of expectations? Now, how does that enter into what we see here? Next thing is comment on how the patterning of choices in terms of lexicogrammatical features contributes to the cohesiveness and coherence of the text. First thing, look at the transitivity table. Look at it in terms of the process types: material, mental, verbal, relational. Who is in the ER role? What observations can you make? All right, so here I have on the screen, and again, that's why I asked you to sort of print it out, because I know it. I mean, I hope your screen is big enough for you to be taking a look here. Now, not every time I do an analysis, I may not give you the tense, but I did here, and you can guess that it is relevant, all right? I don't have what's in the ER role or in the ED role. And that wasn't meaning that it wasn't unimportant. I did put something in red here: left, communicated, selected, established, expected, explained. These were in the passive voice, and I indicated that these were in the passive voice. use of passive voice. That probably would be a significant feature, right? What do I look at? Well, I mean, yeah, I just can count and I can see how many material processes, any mental processes here, verbal processes, relational, looking at the tense. Do I see any patterns emerging? Now, something that you wouldn't have had, all right, and the students that did this exam wouldn't have had. But I knew what was in the original text before it when the student wrote it the first time. When the student wrote it the first time, the first draft, the student got advice from the coach. This is the original text, and then on the side, on the right-hand side, you see the revised text. What do you notice immediately? The number of clauses is significantly reduced. Why? Because, as one would expect, academic writing, you are packing more into the nominal groups. There is greater nominalization. There is greater lexical density. And the clauses are reduced accordingly. So we notice that that's one thing, all right? Now, I'm just pointing that out to you. I mean, to make a point to you, and that is in looking at academic writing, of course, what are you looking for? Greater use of nominalization, greater clausal simplicity, lexically dense. That's an expectation, right? Material processes. More doing in the revised one. And relational processes almost cut in half, all right? Less relational, more material processes, as that's we observe here. If you just had available the table that was there that's been given on Canvas and was given as part of the exam, you wouldn't see the original, you just see the revised, but you add it up, look at the percentages. What do I notice about the process types? It's not just the percentages, all right? That you don't know. That may be a factor, all right? Not every piece of data is going to be interesting. You more or less are at this point trying to see what patterns do emerge. Now, one pattern that I see emerge is the fact that relational processes all come within one section. All here between sort of beginning in sentence 3 on to through sentence 8. I would go back to the text and take a look at what's there, what is being described. All right, so I notice that texture for that section is more relational, obviously more descriptive. When I look at the tense part, I notice something, and I see past, present, past, past, present perfect, past, to infinitive, past, past perfect. So I am asking myself, do I see past anywhere else? No. I see the use of past here in this one block. Now, what again sets off from sentences 8 on to 11? What can I see as being sort of, that might explain the use of a different tense in this part? All right, now that's just from transitivity. I've noticed certain things. Now, what about the logical? Simple versus complex, parataxis versus hypotaxis. How can I tell? All right, first of all, let me identify sort of the simple. And I'm going to find that where is it really just a simple sentence, or where is there some embedding? And I notice that 2, 4 has some embedding, 7 purely simple, 11 purely simple, 13 with some embedding. Nothing, no simple clauses thereafter. Okay, so let me add them up. 2, no embedding. 3 with some embedding. And complex. So let me just tally up the numbers here, and I find that there's more complex clauses than simple. Simple is about 30%, complex about 70%. How does that compare with other texts that we've looked at? How does that compare with just what we just looked at with Steve Jobs' commencement speech? I remember we have that data there. How does it compare? Look through your past, material, your previous text, to see if any of these sort of statistics, any one of these, you can sort of be comparing with another text. That's sort of what you're doing as a linguist. You're not just looking at a text in isolation, as I said, but taking into account your experience. All right, now take a look at this logical table, and you'll see at the bottom, I added up. Now notice under extension I have 2, because I have 2 relations. Now I'm not counting the clauses, I'm counting the pairs. All right, so I see 2 examples of where there was extension, paratactic extension. I see 1 paratactic enhancement, 9 hypotactic elaboration, 6 hypotactic enhancement. I don't see any projection. You see how I've added up the numbers? Pairs, the pairing, the relations, because we're talking about relations here, okay? So that's what we are doing. We add up these numbers here at the bottom. So let me put it together. I have 3, and if I add up together, I have 18. So 3 out of the 18 is paratactic, 17%. Hypotactic, 83%. Now does it compare with other written work that you've seen? Other examples that we've looked at in terms of, and we do have, again, you have statistics based on texts that we've analyzed of those presidential speeches, right? You go back, take a look, compare. I tell you that the more you are able to illustrate based on material that we've already covered, the examples that we've already used, the better the outcome will be. If you just say here, paratactic 17%, hypotactic 83%, if you just give me the numbers, that means nothing. What does the number tell you? The number tells you that this is what is typical of writing, typical of what we would expect the language of science, the language of academic, as it is used in basically the language of, as it is used in writing. Now, here again, what I've done is, in this case, I'm comparing this text here with the logical relations that I've observed in other academic writing. This was on fungi, is from biology, all right? And the gold, in fact, was a journal paper. The H was a high performer among students in terms of their assignment. They were evaluated highly by their teacher. And I was just comparing the numbers here, and what I found was in the SBO one, there was in fact way more hypotaxis. than even the journal paper for that biology text. Okay, now come back to my table, my logical table. What do I observe? Do you notice where is the parataxis? The parataxis is all in sentences 8 through 12. Do you remember something else happening around that time in that location? Okay. Again, this was if we go back to, I'm sorry that the screen is very small, but you can go back to the slide to see. Where is the parataxis mainly occurring? Between sentences 8 and 12. What else happened at that point? Past tense. What was it that set off this particular block as being different? By now, I think you've gone back to look, right? You've gone back to look at the text. What did you see? Ah, good grief. I shouldn't be using this. I should be going back to look at my Word document. Okay, let me go back to my Word document. And I think it was this one. And we'll go back to 8, sentence 8. In my interview with Miss Shaolina from Merchandising Department, who's in charge of planning budgets, the presentation for sales forecasts, etc., she was not only grateful for job enlargement, job enrichment, but also expressed satisfaction. This was the interview. The information that came from that specific interview with that employee. And so clearly that information would be spoken of in past tense, and it would be because it would be her reporting on what she said, so that would probably be why it was more paratactic. You can explain then why that part is different. It's different in terms of the use of parataxis. It is different in the use of tense. And goes back to the fact that it's telling that story, what took place with this interview with this employee. So it would be explained why it would be that way. Where am I? There. Theme. Well, I don't notice much by way of interpersonal. All right. That to be expected too, right? Don't expect to have a lot of interpersonal. I would be if I was probably looking at maybe a commencement speech, a speech that is being given like by Steve Jobs, who's trying to sort of connect with the audience. I noticed thematic progression here. The small business selected for the study, M2 International Group, NCY Functional. And then in 5, that is mentioned again. And in 4, NCY Functional. So it's repeated, continuous, because it's describing. And if I remember correctly, that was where we also noticed the more relational processes. There is also some kind of linear thematic progression that I notice here at the end of paragraph 6 in sentence 11, the desire for greater involvement, decision making. Then that became what was discussed and elaborated in what followed in the next paragraph, greater involvement in decision making. Mood and modality. Look for the modal auxiliaries. Do they tell you anything? Is there much that you could say about them? Can be severely damaged Could the conclusion, notice, could boost the firm's performance. Why the hedging? That typical in academic writing, right? Should at the top in sentence 12, probability. So you're indicating the probability of something, possibility, but you're hedging a bit in terms of not being too dogmatic in terms of what you're concluding, what you're saying. Why do we hedge? Why not say it out, what we think? Well, because it's easier to contradict someone that just says it plainly as opposed to someone that says could. Well, how can you argue much with that, right? But that's why it's done. It removes sort of a level of possible contradiction. Rhetorical structure. No, I don't expect you to produce a mapping of the rhetorical structure, okay? That would not, that you don't have time for that, definitely. You won't have time for that. But there could be certain things that you might notice. Not just, I don't need to see a mapping of it, but I notice that it begins with more a general statement. That is sort of typical of the phasing of ideas. Remember when we, again, academic writing, we went back to that slate rubric and it talked about how ideas are phased in, general to specific. So we notice that kind of flow here as well. So again, points that could be made about how the texts are structured without necessarily producing a mapping. I'm not expecting you to do analysis. I'm giving you the analysis. So the analyses that you need to be able to complete what I'm asking you to do. All right, so that's what I asked you to do, and we don't have time. Does simple, I have a question here, does simple mean a sentence without a clause? No, of course, a simple means a sentence with one clause. One clause. No causal connections. Nothing related by means of a dependent and a main clause. Simple means one clause. There can be embedding. Now, embedding, remember, we've said is not count as a clause. It counts as part of the nominal group which makes up the other clause. So simple clauses are sentences with one clause, one main verb. That's it. No other additional. How do we define a clause? Basically by the presence of a verb. A verb is what is necessary. It's the obligatory element of any clause. Okay? Is there overlapping between the two concepts, coherence and cohesiveness? They are different, but definitely they're related. Cohesiveness, just when you think of it in terms of texture and architecture, what you see with cohesiveness is a pattern. Okay, you see the pattern defines sort of the blocks of text, where you see a continuous thematic progression. Back to that example, NCY functional, where you kept seeing it repeated as theme. There you could see that the cohesiveness, that continuity, defined that block of text. Was also defined by being more relational in terms of relational processes. We see a repetition, we see a patterning, and that patterning gives it a sense of woven together, and it takes on a particular identity for that. It could be several sentences, could be the paragraph, right? Now, what's coherence then? Take all those pieces. How are they related one to the other? Coherence are the relations that exist between the hierarchical elements that make up the text. Coherence are the relations between the spans, the blocks, whatever you want to call them, of the text. How do you define those spans? By their cohesiveness. Cohesiveness gives an identity, helps you identify what are the components, but how are those components related to one another? That's coherence. Well, I don't have time to go through the not Steve Jobs, the Mitt Romney. So can I ask you to do this? Try it. It's there. It's in that folder on Canvas. It's another example similar to like what we've been looking at today with this one. Try it out. And when we come back in our next class, that'll be week 12. How did you do with it? Take it serious. Give it a real attempt, all right? And see what you would do. And begin, as I'm telling you now, begin to start organizing your material. Don't count on the fact that it's all there in videos or in Canvas in the lectures and the PowerPoints. No, you really got to start to go through and organize those PowerPoint information, those PowerPoints. Organize in terms of the kinds of texts and where did I talk about academic writing? Where did I talk about political speeches? Where did we talk about commencement speeches, etc.? All right. Where did we talk about poetry? Those kinds of things. Organize your material. Have an idea of where, what is, so that when you come to take the test, you can quickly go back to find that material. That will definitely help you when you can go back and say, well, this is what we observed in the analysis of this text and how it relates to the analysis of the text that is on the exam. That will help. But don't expect to be able to go through. You won't have time to do that unless it's organized already. But now you know what to expect on the exam. And we'll take a look at next week, not next week, 2 weeks' time, we will go through the other mock test and see how you do. All right? Okay, so I wish you all a happy Easter, a happy holiday to come. I know I've given you a lot of work and you're working on the commentary, but I hope that that proceeds well. Okay, so see you in 2 weeks' time. Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Have a good break in the
You too.
coming holiday. Bye-bye.
Good night.